We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar hosted by Current Consulting Group and sponsored by OraSure Technologies. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group. Today's presenters are Brian Feely from OraSure Technologies and Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group. Brian is the Director of Sales for OraSure Technologies Substance Abuse Testing Division. He has over 40 years of experience in the industry working in technical, business development, and sales and marketing capacities. He is named as an inventor on 4 patents in the diagnostic field and has numerous publications. Brian has been at OraSure Technologies for the past 24 plus years, where he's focused on providing oral fluid, drugs of abuse, and alcohol testing products. Brian and his team educate and train national laboratory partners, TPAs, and end users on the benefits of oral fluid testing to enhance their substance abuse screening programs. Also today we have Bill Current, who is the author of Why Drug Testing, Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance abuse related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has been the #1 recognized brand name in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. He created Current Compliance, the most up-to-date and comprehensive online subscription database on all state laws related to workplace drug testing, including marijuana and workplace compensation laws. And we'd like to go ahead and first turn the virtual microphone over to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, and pleasure to be presenting again today with my good friend Bill Current, and I welcome everyone to the webinar. So first, going to show this slide obligatory on our side for our product called InteliSwab, and it's a new rapid antigen test that we're very proud to be able to deliver to the market and help out in the current pandemic, extended pandemic that we're in. And essentially the next couple slides will talk briefly about the product and give you an idea of where it could potentially be used and how it could help out in our communities and our workplaces. I have to state the product has not been FDA cleared or approved, but it has been authorized by the FDA under what we're all probably very familiar with now, called an EUA, an emergency use authorization. Basically, it's a test for the detection of proteins for SARS-CoV-2, not other viruses and pathogens. And I'll let you read the last part and not go through those grueling details. So next slide, please. Okay, so InteliSwab is a rapid antigen test, and you've probably heard of PCR tests and antibody tests and antigen tests. Well, this is a rapid antigen test that detects basically the presence of the virus, but not using a PCR test, using a test that goes after one of the proteins that is common to the actual virus itself. Very simple to use. It's a visually read out type of a test, like a drug test or a home pregnancy test that has visual readout of a line, a control line, and a test line. So very easy to interpret. There's no equipment needed. This is actually a lower nasal swab test. So a few swipes around both nostrils, then it goes down into the developer solution and you wait for the results. So probably the easiest test to use on the market today from that standpoint. Very nicely, actually, we've gotten it approved for both symptomatic and asymptomatic use. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And I'll also cover kind of the 3 different versions or configurations of the test that we did get approved. The rapid one, which is an over-the-counter 2-pack, an RX or prescription use version of the test, and then the Pro, which is designed for healthcare professionals. I will say up front, this right now is approved for ages 15 and above. We are working on getting that studies completed in pediatrics and much, from ages 2 and up, so that we have that additional claim, and those are in the works right now. So bottom line, really simple to use, fast antigen test that's efficient, practical, and I think if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the performance and the accuracy data. So the FDA requires at least an 80% sensitivity and 895 or more specificity. So our InteliSwab exceeded those hallmarks. And we have compared to PCR, we have an 84% sensitivity and a 98% specificity. Importantly, our test was done, and in our clinical studies, it was done with untrained and unproctored lay users. So as opposed to, a healthcare professional or putting it in the hands of people who are familiar with running tests like this, as some of the other tests on the market have done, we didn't go down that road. We went after untrained, unproctored users so that we could get the broad claims that we got of over-the-counter and professional and prescription use. So all in all, InteliSwab was designed to detect those who are most contagious in those early stages, but also detect the people who aren't contagious, so that they can go about their normal lives and carry on. This slide, it really is probably one of the more important ones in terms of what are we using it for and how can it be applied in the market. So the left-hand side is the rapid test. That's the over-the-counter version. So it comes in a box, and there are 2 tests in that box. We call that a serial test format, right? So for this particular test, it'll be available over the counter very soon, or you can buy it from a reseller, or you can buy it from OraSure if you're a workplace account, and it comes in boxes of 24 2-packs. It's non-prescription, so you can't get reimbursed for it. But the nice part about it, again, is you can use it for both symptomatic and non-symptomatic individuals. It's designed to be run as a serial test so that you test initially, and then within 24 to 36 hours, you do the second test that comes in the box, and that further increases the efficiency of the test to rule out being positive. Of course, if you get a positive on the first time around that you run it, then it's advised to call your healthcare professional and seek follow-up with your doctor. The home use RX version similarly can be used in the home, but it's done under the prescriptive authority of a doctor or someone who would be prescribing that test for you, and in that mode it can get reimbursed. The one difference between this RX version and the home over-the-counter and the Rapid Pro, which I'll get to in a second, is this is really designed for people that have symptoms in the first 7 days from symptom onset. And again, it can be self-collected by the person, an adult, or if it's someone between ages 15 and I believe it's 18, it's supposed to be collected by an adult for that age group. The professional use version is for your healthcare providers out there. So this is done in a patient care settings where there would be a CLIA waiver in place, a doctor's office, a clinic, medical or healthcare facility within a manufacturer or a school health center, if you will, that has a CLIA waiver. Can be done for, again, patients that have symptoms from the first 7 days of onset, or individuals who don't have symptoms, which again, we recommend the use of 2 of those to do the serial test to improve on the overall accuracy of the test. So those are the 3 formats. Again, we're very proud to have gotten our EUAs on these different tests, and we're offering them now pretty regularly. We're still gearing up on the manufacturing side to meet the demand, and looking forward to doing that in the next month or 2 as we continue to ramp up our manufacturing to supply the market out there with yet another great test. So Bill, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, Brian, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing that information. For the audience's purpose, I've known Brian a long time, many years. We've been in the industry together. There are few people I've ever met who know as much as he does about drug testing in general, but specifically about oral fluid testing. But beyond that, none of us knew anything about COVID testing, a year and a half ago. And Brian is among a really small handful of people that I associate with who's really become an expert on this. So that's very interesting information. Yesterday, I did a presentation, a virtual presentation, as part of the Arizona SHRM conference, and I talked about COVID testing, vaccinations, COVID safe practices as part of my presentation yesterday. And if you think about the different types of COVID tests that are out there. The nasopharyngeal, which you might not know by that name, you might know more as the really deep nasal passage type of test that's somewhat painful. You know, and it was very common at the beginning of the pandemic before some of these other technologies came out. You know, what we're talking about here really sort of changes that game, makes it possible for people to actually, you know, become the collector themselves. It's sort of a self-driven or a donor-driven type of collection. So I think it's a game changer. And unfortunately, and I don't mean to discourage anybody, but I think COVID testing is here for the long term. You know, there was a study out of Australia 2 weeks ago that was predicting the variants right behind the Delta variant, the next two that are coming. Some of them may not reach the United States, heaven forbid it that they do, but we want to be prepared for it. And if you're concerned about being infected, you're showing some signs or symptoms, you want some peace of mind, you know, this type of test makes it possible for you to administer the test yourself, possibly, and then have the assurance that you're not sick, or take the result and then go see a professional health practitioner. So great information. Thank you very much for that, Brian. We're going to talk about something we call non-drug testing drug testing, and then that's going to lead into a discussion about some of the more recent developments with the legalization of marijuana. But this idea came to us about a month or so ago as we were putting the Current Consulting Group newsletter together, that we're seeing some trends in drug testing that are sort of diluting the effectiveness of drug testing. They're making drug testing programs in some workplaces less effective. And so we're going to talk about those and why these certain trends are actually dangerous and really sort of begin to dilute your return on investment in drug testing. And so let's start with this definition of a non-denial denial. That's sort of where it all came from. So according to Wikipedia, a non-denial denial is a statement that at first hearing seems to be a direct, clear-cut, and unambiguous denial of some alleged accusation, but after being parsed carefully, turns out to not be a denial at all. Now, we normally associate non-denial denials with politicians, right? Something bad happens, they go on TV, they make a carefully worded statement, and we all feel a sense of relief. And then we sort of think through what they just said, and we realize they didn't really deny anything. You know, so a non-denial denial drug testing program, a non-drug testing drug testing program, is one that has all the appearances of being a solid, comprehensive, drug-free workplace drug testing program, but in the end doesn't really accomplish much. It's just basically checking a box. You're collecting a sample, an oral fluid sample or urine sample, you're sending it to a lab, you're getting them analyzed, but in reality, it's not about achieving drug-free workplace objectives like safety and productivity and profitability. It's just basically checking a box. Well, that's better than no drug testing at all, but it's not going to achieve certain objectives. So let's look at 3 specific trends in drug testing that are worth considering if you're going to do any of these non-drug testing drug testing things I'm going to talk about in a minute. One, we know that companies testing for marijuana is dropping. We've seen that in the results from the Current Consulting Group annual survey of employers, which we just released about a month or so ago. I'm doing a presentation next Tuesday for First Advantage on the survey results. It's dropping. You can see the blue bar is 2020, the orange bar is 2021. So the percentage of companies that indicated that they have considered removing or have removed marijuana from their drug test panel in the last 12 months increased from 5% to 9%, and that's in the next 12 months if they're considering doing it. Now look at the middle chart. Marijuana positive drug test results up significantly, as you can see there, just from one drug testing company's experience. And then over to the right, we see that oral fluid drug testing has increased dramatically since 2018 at one major laboratory, Quest Diagnostics, 1.3 million to over 2 million in 2020. That's a statistically significant increase by any way that you look at it. Oral fluid testing is clearly the fastest growing segment of the drug testing industry right now. And COVID, unfortunately, none of us wanted to go through what COVID caused, but it forced a lot of people to sort of relook at how they do drug testing and find more efficient and streamlined ways to do it. I'm a fan of urine testing and of hair testing as well, and of point of collection, rapid result testing, but oral fluid testing among all of those has been the fastest growing segment or product line in the drug testing industry. And some of it has to do with the legalization of marijuana, a large part of it, because a lot of employers are concerned whether or not they have the right to test for marijuana in states that have legalized it. So this map shows the states that have legalized marijuana. The orange ones have legalized recreational or so-called adult use marijuana. The blue states are, the blue states are the states that have legalized medical marijuana, and then the white states are the ones that haven't passed either type of law yet. The thing about the orange states is that all of them already had medical marijuana laws in place except South Dakota, which legalized both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana on the same day. All the other states started with medical marijuana laws and then progressed to adult use or recreational marijuana laws. So over 36 states altogether with legal marijuana laws. And Mississippi, right there in the middle, you see is sort of a dark gray. Voters in Mississippi during the general election voted to legalize medical marijuana. However, the Supreme Court later ruled that the process was unconstitutional according to the state constitution. So their legalization movement is on hold. We do anticipate that that will get ironed out and it will become a medical marijuana state. But it gives you a sense here of where we're at as a nation and why certain companies are looking toward other testing options as a way to deal with the increase in marijuana usage. And these are results from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that comes out every year from the federal government. The new one should be coming out any day now. You can see that between 2018 and 2019, and the results are always 1 year behind where we're at. So when the 2020 results come in, it'll be the 2021 report. So, but between 2018 and 2019, you can see that the use of marijuana increased dramatically from 15.9% to 17.5%, almost an entire 2% increase percentage-wise. Meantime, psychotherapeutic drug use like antidepressants and anxiety medications, et cetera, dropped from 6.2% to 5.9%. We expect that to go up in this year's numbers because of the dramatic increase in opioid use that occurred during the pandemic. When we asked those companies that were considering dropping marijuana from the drug test panel, why, 12.5% said it was because testing for marijuana was not permitted in their state. And that's simply not true. Testing for marijuana is legal in all 50 states. In every state that's legalized marijuana, you're still legally permitted to drug test your employees for marijuana. There may be some limitations on what you can do with a positive test result for marijuana. And in New York City and in Philadelphia, you're not allowed to pre-employment screen people for marijuana except a long list of safety sensitive occupations. But testing for marijuana is legal in every state. To drop marijuana from your drug test panel because you think it's illegal in your state requires a little bit more research on your part to make sure that you truly understand what the law in your state is saying, because no state has prohibited testing for marijuana. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about the 5 signs of a non-drug testing drug testing program. Think as we go through this, if any of this applies to you or to any of your clients and what you might be able to do about it. So number 1 is not testing for marijuana. That's, in my opinion, the most dangerous form of a non-drug testing drug testing program because you're excluding the number 1 illicit drug of abuse. And you say, well, Bill, how can you refer to it as an illicit drug when 36 states have legalized it? Well, marijuana is still illegal under federal law. It's still under the Controlled Substances Act, it's still considered illegal. It's a Schedule I controlled substance, meaning it cannot be prescribed. That's why when you see a medical marijuana law passed in a state, it typically doesn't refer to a doctor prescribing marijuana because it's illegal under federal law to prescribe a Schedule I drug. You can't prescribe cocaine or heroin because they're Schedule I controlled substances, just like marijuana. And yet, if you exclude marijuana from your drug testing panel, the number 1 illicit drug of abuse in the country, you're essentially inviting all the marijuana users to come apply for a job at your company. And if you're not testing them post hire, then you're inviting them to come to work high on marijuana, regardless of what kind of job that they're doing. And predictably, you'll see increases in all the negative things that are associated with drug abuse: absenteeism, turnover, accidents, the filing of workers' compensation claims, and a decrease in productivity and other safe work behaviors. Now, keep in mind that according to one study that was done by the federal government, by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, found that typical, regular, illicit drug users work for 2 to 3 employers a year. So you hire somebody, you go through the trouble and the expense of doing that. If they're a regular substance abuser, including marijuana users, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to have to replace that person versus hiring somebody who's not a substance abuser. So it makes sense to test for marijuana. It makes sense to include it in your drug test panel. And there are a number of legal reasons why you would want to consider that, because you're still responsible for the behavior of your employees, even if marijuana is legal in your state. There are 2 doctrines of law that still apply: negligent hiring and respondeat superior. These are laws that hold employers responsible for the actions, the acts, the behavior of their employees when they're operating or functioning within the scope of employment. Say you hire somebody to operate or to drive a delivery van for you. If they're high on marijuana while they're making the delivery and they cause an accident and, heaven forbid, hurt or kill someone, you, the employer, can be held legally liable for that accident and all of the costs, all of the property damage, all of the medical expenses that may come out of that. You can be held responsible unless you can show that you made a good faith effort by drug testing, in this case, to either not hire such a person in the first place, or to make sure that you were doing your part to deter individuals from working well under the influence of marijuana or any other drug. And I won't go through all the details of the Kentucky case, Algiers versus MB Transportation, but sometimes the financial impact of such a legal challenge can be devastating to a small company. In this case, $5 million in compensatory and punitive damages, because the employer was unaware when it hired an employee who was an alcoholic, actually living in a rehabilitation center at the time that they were hired. Number 2 on our list of non-drug testing, drug testing signs is only testing for marijuana. Some companies have dropped all other drugs and they're only testing for marijuana, which I think is extremely dangerous, because all the studies show right now that coming into 2020, opioid abuse was already going back up again. And as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns that came from that, many more people began, quote unquote, self-medicating their way through it by abusing opioids and amphetamines, as well as marijuana and alcohol. One major drug testing provider said that for the first time ever, they had more amphetamine positives for random testing than marijuana positives in 2020. So only testing for marijuana is really sort of encouraging all the other types of drugs to be abused by your employees or applicants applying for a position with your company. These are the results from that one company. You can see the 2019-2020 drug test result comparison from random testing that they did. Marijuana up, cocaine down slightly, but look at opioids and amphetamines. Opioids up over 173% and amphetamines over 215%. And if you look at the top bar of the amphetamine orange bar there, you can see it's actually higher than the marijuana bar on the far left. That's because there were actually more amphetamine positives from random testing at this one major drug testing company than there were for marijuana. You can't afford to drop other drugs from your drug testing panel and just test for marijuana and assume that you're going to have a safe and legally defensible program. Number 3, testing for marijuana with one drug testing method and all other drugs with another drug testing method. I call this the classic shooting in the dark approach. The fact is that a high percentage of marijuana users are what are referred to as polydrug users, meaning they don't limit their substance abuse just to marijuana, but they use alcohol, they use cigarettes as well, but they use alcohol and they use other substances of abuse like synthetic opioids or cocaine or other types of illicit drugs. And so if you're just testing for marijuana with one testing method that only detects marijuana, then you're potentially missing all the other possible drugs that that person may have in their system at that time. Maybe they test negative for marijuana on any given day, but they would have tested positive for all these other drugs if you were testing with one consistent method. That's not to say that you can't have a urine testing program and an oral fluid testing program at the same time, but when you test, you want to test for all the drugs from that sample. So if you're doing oral fluid, you want to test for a wider drug test panel than just marijuana. If you're doing urine, same thing. You want to test for a broader drug test panel than just opioids or just cocaine or just amphetamines. So you're increasing your chances of 50-50 to 100% if that person actually has those drugs in their system. One of the things that we saw during the pandemic was a little bit of a hit to the total volume of alcohol testing. Now, when I talk about all of these things, of course, I'm not referring to DOT mandated drug testing because those requirements are in place. They don't change. DOT requires you to test for marijuana for pre-employment, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, random testing. None of that changes, and the DOT regulations preempt or trump state drug testing laws, even those legal marijuana laws. But alcohol testing outside of the DOT regulations took a little bit of a hit during the pandemic because some employers were concerned about the fact that it appeared, and I've got some data to show you on the next slide, that alcohol abuse was up even though more people were working from home. And they were also concerned about the deep lung air sample that's required as part of a breath or an evidentiary breath type of test. So any kind of a test that requires a deep lung air sample of breath from back into the lungs is potentially a way of spreading the virus. In other words, people becoming exposed to that. And so some employers were concerned about that. But alcohol abuse continued to go up during the pandemic. In the early days of the pandemic, there were studies that came out that showed on the left side of the screen a dramatic increase in alcoholic beverage sales. Everything from mixed cocktails and beer to wine and every form of alcoholic beverage. Those sales went up dramatically, and it was mostly from online sales. We also know from studies that have been done that 1 in 3 Americans are more likely to drink alcohol during working hours while working from home as a result of COVID. So you've got more people working from home, not under supervision like they would be in the office or at some other work site, and they're more likely, 33% more likely, to be using alcohol during the workday. 36% for men, 26% for women. The overall consumption of alcohol was up about 14% last year among workers, and heavy drinking was up about 18.8%. And I said among workers, that's not correct. The general population, that's the accurate way to say that. So we know alcohol abuse went up. We know that some companies were a little hesitant to continue testing with breath. And so there was a little bit of a hit there, according to the current consulting group surveys that we did. But alcohol use up, alcohol testing down a little bit, but the need for alcohol testing still as important as ever. And then finally, the fifth sign is not conducting pre-employment testing. We saw a lot of companies questioning whether or not they should do pre-employment testing for a couple of reasons. One, there was this dramatic increase in the unemployment rate during the pandemic. So it skyrocketed up above 15%. But then, so it was hard to find people. There weren't jobs out there to begin with, but then jobs started opening up as the economy began to open up. And some people were concerned because more people were using drugs as a result of the pandemic that they couldn't find people to hire if they kept doing pre-employment testing, especially for marijuana. However, as you see there in the third bullet, the negative consequences of workplace substance abuse are undeniable. The more substance abusers that you hire, the more costs that you're going to incur. And a study came out from the University of Chicago that concluded that the average cost of each substance abuser annually is over $8,800 a year. But if you're looking at a workers' compensation claim, it could be over $40,000 a year. And if it's a vehicular related workers' compensation claim, it could be over $70,000 in just one claim. So you add all of those costs together, and the potential cost to an employer can be in the tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even higher. The average cost of a claim involving a fatality is over $1 million. So it doesn't make sense to put a company in the position of hiring or increasing the possibility of hiring substance abusers because you're concerned about finding someone to hire. I think the more prudent concern should be finding the right people to hire and doing the type of pre-employment screening, whether it's drug testing, whether it's background screens, or whether it's some type of impairment benchmarking tests that are becoming more popular now, so that you can at least, at the very least, come back and say, this is what we do to screen our employees. This is what our clients do to screen their employees. They do it every time, and we make a good faith effort to avoid hiring people who have a higher possibility of causing an accident or injuring somebody on the job. Pre-employment testing avoids all of that. And one of the things that I heard, not unlike the people who were confused about the legality of testing for marijuana, is that pre-employment testing is not allowed in some states. And that's simply not true. Pre-employment testing is legal in every state. In the city of New York, you're not allowed to pre-employment test for marijuana, except for certain safety sensitive positions, which there's a long list of them for the city of New York and the city of Philadelphia. But pre-employment testing for marijuana and testing for marijuana generally is legal elsewhere in New York and in every other state. Pre-employment testing saves money, and it's legal in every state. If somebody recommends that you not do pre-employment testing, I would run as fast as possible in the opposite direction. It's a valuable tool to protect the viability and the profitability of your company, and to protect or to give you an added measure of legal defensibility should anybody ever challenge your program. And to add some frosting on the cake, the federal government did a study several years ago. This is a little bit old, but I think these are sort of timeless types of statistics that found that 40% of regular substance abusers, meaning people who use drugs at least once every month, who are employed full-time, 40% said they were less likely to work for a company that does random testing, and 30% said they were less likely to work for a company that does pre-employment testing. Clearly, substance abusers hate drug testing. And so just the very fact that you do pre-employment testing is going to deter some drug users from even applying for a job with your company. Okay, please be thinking of some questions that you'd like to ask. I'm going into the last part of my presentation. We're going to talk now about the legalization of marijuana, but we're going to take a somewhat unique angle or perspective on this discussion, okay? So we know that marijuana positivities, workplace positive drug test results, surged in 2020 from all different types of tests, urine, oral fluid, and hair. The second bullet, very important, marijuana positivity particularly surged in states with legal recreational laws, not necessarily states with only medical marijuana laws, but states that have opened it wide, like California, Oregon, Colorado, Washington, you name it, a whole bunch of states, right? New York, more recently, Connecticut. In those states, there has been a dramatic 118.2% increase from 2012 to 2020 in marijuana positive drug test results. Legalizing recreational marijuana is a harbinger of more people in the workplace being high on marijuana while on the job. Overall positivity of all drugs increased from 3.8% in 2020 to was 12.12% higher. Let me say that correctly. Increased 3.8% in 2020 and was 12.2% higher than in 2016. So hopefully I made it clear. It didn't increase to 12.2%, but it increased 3.8% overall. It's 12.2% higher than what the percentage was in 2016. Now, let me come back and make a point that's not shown on the slide. which is if you look at the 2020 report from the federal government on the level of substance abuse by employment categories, you'll see that among full-time workers, the percentage who admitted to being regular substance abusers was just under 15%. So if you're looking at just people who have full-time jobs, nearly 1 in 6 admit that they're regular substance abusers. And to add a little bit to that number, many years ago, and the federal government's been doing this annual study every year for over 3 decades. It used to be called the Household Survey on Drug Abuse and Health, and now it's the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. But many years ago, they did a study on the study, if you will, right? Good use of government funds, but I think they came up with something pretty interesting, which is they found that the results of their annual report were about 1/3 lower than the reality. In other words, if drug abuse was 20%, then it was, in reality, if people were telling the truth, it would have been 1/3 higher than that. And so in some cases, these numbers, we look at them, they're shocking, they're not good, and yet it's very possible that they're not even a realistic view, that the realistic view is higher. Now, when you look at positive drug test results, those are based on actual results. So we can really rely on those. But when we're looking at drug use statistics from the federal government, which are not shown on this screen, okay, then the results could actually be higher than what the federal government reports. Now, take all of that into consideration and store it up in your brain for a second, and let's talk about marijuana impairment. I started putting together a list of all the claims that the pro-marijuana people make, whether they're, sort of taking a swipe at drug testing, which many of them do, or they're just sort of purely in it to make all drugs of abuse legal, like in Oregon, where they decriminalized all drugs during the 2020 presidential campaign or election. They voted to decriminalize heroin, cocaine, etc. But if you look at all the reports, all the claims about marijuana, the one that is most concerning are the sort of the diluting claims made about marijuana impairment. I've read so many of them, it's almost nauseous, but there are so many people who make what I think are false claims about the impairment or the impairment impact of marijuana. So a report out of the University of Sydney, which was published in the Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews journal, 80 separate studies. Okay, so it wasn't a new study, but it was a review of 80 independent studies, found that, quote, depending on how much THC is taken, how it's used, and the person taking it, they found cognitive impairment could last between 3 and 10 hours. So when you hear somebody talk about the high or the impairing impact of marijuana being over within an hour or 2 or 3, in reality, from a long list of studies, the conclusion was that the cognitive impairment could last 3 to 10 hours. Look at the next bullet. The analysis indicates that impairment may last up to 10 hours if high doses of THC are consumed orally. So how you take the drug has a direct impact on impairment as well. A more typical duration of impairment, however, is 4 hours when lower doses of THC are consumed via smoking or vaporization, and simpler tasks are undertaken. Cognitive skills like reaction time or remembering something, versus, as you see in the last bullet, more complex tasks like driving, operating a forklift, driving a delivery event. In those cases, that type of impairing impact on the brain could last up to 6 or 7 hours. Higher doses of THC are inhaled and more complex tasks are required of the user. So it's a little bit across the board, right? But to sort of take an average, if you go back to that first bullet, the cognitive impairment, people hearing what you're saying, understanding what you're saying, remembering what you're telling them to do, and then remembering how to do it correctly, that kind of impairment, 3 to 10 hours. And then for more complex tasks, as you see in the bottom bullet, up to 6 or 7 hours. So if impairment can last 6 to 7 hours, but up to 10 or more hours, then you really, if you're concerned about the negative impact of the impairing effects of marijuana in your workplace on safety and other factors, then you want a drug test result or drug test method that can detect recent use of marijuana within minutes and has a window of detection of at least 10 hours to cover the entire window of impairment. And so you want to be able to, meet the dual priorities of keeping your workplace safe, but also perhaps in legal marijuana states like Illinois, which is very restrictive, not prying too far back into the private behavior of your employees. So you have certain drug testing methods to consider, but you want to make sure that you're picking one that's going to help you achieve your objectives. And so if you look at the window of detection of certain drug testing methods for THC, breath, oral fluid, and urine, you see that you do have the immediate recent use detectability with breath and oral fluid, but only oral fluid covers that entire 10-hour window of impairment. Now, why does urine start clear over on the left and not over on, or clear over on the right, not over the left like oral fluid? That's because it takes about 6 to 7 hours, thereabouts, before a drug is detectable in a urine sample. That's because when we do urine testing, we're detecting a metabolite of a drug that's been used. And that takes about 6 to 7 hours before the body metabolizes the drug and it's detectable in urine. With oral fluid, you're detecting the parent drug, the drug itself, and that becomes detectable within about 15 minutes or so after somebody's used the drug. So if somebody is coming back from a lunch break and they were eating lunch in their car out in the parking lot and they smell of marijuana, they're staggering a little bit, their eyes are red, they're not making sense when they talk, you suspect they may be under the influence of marijuana. If you test with urine, and that's the last time that they used marijuana, they're probably not going to test positive because that window of detection takes a few hours to open up. You will detect them with oral fluid and with breath and with blood for that matter, because they're capable of detecting recent use. But if you want a drug test for a method that covers the entire 10-hour window of detection, up to 10 hours, let's say, to be fair, then you want something more like oral fluid that detects recent use, but also can detect far into that window of impairment. And the legalization of marijuana means more people are using marijuana, more people are testing positive, and all of those things that are listed there in the bullets, like people falling off ladders and causing accidents or being late for work or not showing up for work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of which negatively impact productivity. All of those things increase exponentially as you hire more and more marijuana users in your workplace. So my advice is take a stand against marijuana. Don't surrender to it. It's legal in every state. You do have the right to prohibit employees from using marijuana on the job, bringing marijuana into the workplace, and being at work impaired or under the influence of marijuana. Those are rights that you have in all 50 states, even in the most liberal, most restrictive states that have legalized marijuana. You are still allowed to do those three things. And if you're worried about prying too far into the private life of your employees, you're really just looking for job performance issues. So you're prohibiting people from using marijuana on the job, but you're not necessarily saying what your company position or your personal position is on using marijuana outside the workplace. Just keep it out of my workplace. Don't come to work under the influence, and be as productive as I hired you to be and what my supervisors are going to be looking for. Be clear in your policy that employees may not use marijuana on the job, may not be impaired by marijuana on the job, and cannot bring marijuana into the workplace, or that individual could face adverse employment action depending on the state laws that apply to your company. So in conclusion, a comprehensive drug testing program is one that includes a robust drug test panel, marijuana for sure, but the other common illicit drugs of abuse that includes pre-employment testing, that has an alcohol testing component for post-accident and a reasonable suspicion, and is still a zero tolerance policy when it comes to individuals not able to do their job because of any reason at all. One possibility being because they're either impaired or under the influence of marijuana on the job. If you're going to take adverse employment action and you're working with a positive drug test result for marijuana, combine it with the other factors that led to the drug test, the poor performance, the absenteeism, confrontation in the workplace, or an accident, or repeating unsafe behavior in the workplace, and combine all of that together with the drug test result to strengthen the legal defensibility of your decision to take adverse employment actions. Okay, that's a powerful, results-oriented approach to drug-free workplace and to drug testing. And it says a message that at this company, we're concerned about safety, we're concerned about being profitable and taking care of our employees and making sure that everybody's safe, because in the end, the vast majority of your employees are not substance abusers, okay? But just as importantly, it creates a legal shield in the event of a lawsuit brought on by an accident caused by a worker who was high on marijuana while on the job or any other dangerous drug. Don't surrender to drug abuse. Don't surrender to marijuana. Have a marijuana testing program. Make sure your policy reflects that and that you're doing everything in your power to comply with the laws that apply to you, but you're not acquiescing to the marijuana legalization movement and allowing them to put you in a position where your profitability and viability as a company is compromised because you didn't test for marijuana. And with that, Jessica, do we have any questions from our audience? Because I have a couple of questions for Brian, but let's see if there's anything from the audience first.
Bill, why don't you go ahead, as we're bringing in questions from the audience, why don't you go ahead and ask your questions to Brian, and I will tally these questions. As a reminder, those of you who do have questions who have not yet submitted them, please submit them to the questions section, and we will be sure to answer those questions. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, so Brian, you're there, right?
I am, Bill.
Okay, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, and I'll let our audience know that I didn't give Brian a heads up I was going to ask this question, but and it has, you know, it's a drug testing related question, because you've been in the industry a long time. You've seen a lot of things come and go. We both have seen different products come on the market and disappear very quickly. What is, in your opinion, one of the things that makes oral fluid testing something that you believe is going to be around for the long haul, for years and years to come?
So, yeah, Bill, I think it has a lot to do with the flexibility of oral fluid testing and the fact that it's very easy to do. You can collect an oral fluid sample can be collected pretty much anytime, anywhere. That brings a whole element of or reduces a whole element of complexity that you see today, and we've seen for years, right? Which is both for third-party administrators and for end users, companies that have a program. The complexity of getting a urine sample collected. And today with COVID and everything else going on, less people want to go to these sorts of clinics to get a sample collected. They want it to be able to be done anytime, anywhere. So it adds that flexibility to the overall collection process, and that you just don't get with urine. And then secondly, I would say that it has to do with the back end piece of what does an oral fluid sample represent relative to other types of tests. And because, and you covered this nicely in your slides and talking about the windows of detection a bit, and I spoke about this at SAPA last week when this question came up about, you know, recent use versus longer term use. One of the nice features to oral fluid is you really are looking at a window of detection that's pretty much right after use, up to a day, and other methods don't really give you that, right? Breath is real short, only giving you 3 hours, and it's only marijuana. Urine is only detected out to, well, it starts at about 6 hours after someone has used a drug and then goes out for several days. So it really doesn't link super well to a potential impairment window. And then hair, of course, is way out, which is great if you're looking for lifestyle and long-term indication. But oral fluid has that sweet spot of being right after use up to about a day, and that's the time period that fits the best with recent use and potential impairment, which fits ideally with the safety sensitive program that someone wants to have and wants to implement. But the neat part about it, again, is because you're not going back 2 or 3 days or 4 days, you're not infringing on someone's personal life where maybe they are in a state where marijuana is legal and they do use it on the weekend or on their spare time, but they're not high on the job. Oral fluid fits that window very nicely. So those would be the main things I would say, Bill.
Okay, and another question that I've heard a lot of people ask, maybe you can help us understand this. Why is FDA clearance for a drug testing product or an assay in the laboratory? Why is that important? Because there are non-FDA cleared drug testing products out on the market. Why does FDA clearance, why should that be important to an employer?
Well, I mean, FDA, of course, is a seal of approval that people are familiar with and comfortable with and rely upon to know that something has been run by the FDA. And so if we put a claim in our package insert or in our labeling, you know that that's been reviewed by the FDA. It's not just something we said as a company, or some consultant said that you might have brought in to help you write up your package inserts on a test that's not FDA cleared. So it validates what a manufacturer is saying. If they're saying they have 95% specificity or sensitivity, you have to compile the data. You have to do it in a way that conforms to the way the FDA wants to see those studies done, which, by the way, of course, is always being reviewed by the FDA. And they're always looking for ways to, I don't want to say make it more difficult, but what they do is they typically look at, as a product and as a certain type of product gets better over time, they basically look at the latest ones to say, okay, well, these guys now have better performance. They did their studies more extensively, so this now becomes the way we want. We call that a predicate device. This is how they then want to see it. So they're constantly revising things, making it more accountable to the public, so that that if it's been through the FDA approval process, it's been through that gold seal process that makes it much more reliable, and also legally defensible. So if you ever had to go to court, one of the things that an attorney will probably look at is, was the product approved? Did they use a process that is forensically defensible? And the FDA approval piece of it is just one of those.
Now, a lot of people know, of course, that urine testing has been endorsed by SAMHSA, by the federal government, for over 3 decades. And in 2019, in October of 2019, SAMHSA issued final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing. What's the impact of that? Because you still can't use oral fluid for DOT yet. We know that DOT is in the process of developing regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing, but why would that be important to an employer at this stage?
Well, I mean, I think that, when we first launched oral fluid testing 20 plus years ago, there was a lot of early adopters who were really, stepping out of their comfort zone and trying something very new that, well, even though we had FDA approval back then, it wasn't through it wasn't through HHS, right, through SAMHSA at all. So over time, what has happened is, more accounts have adopted oral fluid, and many more have. But here we are 20 years later, and now that the federal government has at least endorsed it and put their seal on it and said, hey, lab-based oral fluid drug testing, here are the guidelines for it, and if you follow this, you're following a federally approved program. Not only does that give a lot of companies and third-party administrators comfort that they're now using a technology that's been approved by HHS for use in workplace programs, but that also sets the stage for the DOT to put out their proposed rulemaking and to move forward with it to be able to be used for DOT. And that's the process we're still waiting to come out. But so for all of even the non-regulated companies, it basically has said, okay, this really does meet the muster now of a defensible test. There are HHS guidelines, and even the more non-regulated consumers seem to be coming on board now because they feel comfortable with laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing.
Okay, and because urine testing is not capable of detecting recent use, there's that 6-7 hour lag time before the metabolite becomes detectable. Is it fair to refer to lab-based oral fluid testing as the only federally endorsed recent use drug test method?
Yeah, I would say so. If you're talking about recent use being within in hours, absolutely.
Okay, and here's another question from our audience, and I'll just read it. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's a good question. We use oral fluid POCT with oral fluid lab-based confirmation on some of our Canadian projects and are concerned with the reliability of oral fluid POCT, higher false negative rate versus urine. The cutoff levels for oral fluid POCT a little bit different. Are you seeing any concerns from employers regarding oral fluid POCT?
So, you know, the point of care tests that are out there, there are a few that are FDA cleared, right? So number one, if you're sticking with an FDA cleared product, you know at least that it has gone through the clinical studies and trials and has been verified by the FDA that company followed the protocols and that the test performs the way they say it performs. So if you're talking about non-regulated testing, I think it's up to the employer to verify that they've got a good test, ideally that it is FDA cleared, that they're following the right protocols when they do get a screen positive, that they follow up with a laboratory-based test. Some companies even go the next step, which is regardless of whether they get a positive or a negative, they follow up with a lab-based oral fluid test so that they know they've got sample to sample. It's not different matrix. You know, they can get somebody started if they're negative with a POCT test, maybe not put them in a safety sensitive mode that first day, right? But wait for the lab-based test to come back and verify it. We've seen algorithms like that. And then finally, on your question about cutoffs, so most of the POCT products that I've seen, the oral fluid products, and the one that we actually sell, the cutoffs are very similar between lab-based oral fluid and the point of care device, except for that of THC. And one of the things that some employers like is the fact that the POCT cutoff is higher than it is for lab-based oral fluid testing, because they want that, they don't want to necessarily see every positive that a lab-based test picks up. They want to know that the window of detection is such that this was somebody that used very recently in the last 6 to 8 hours. They're the most risk in the workplace, and they're willing to take on that kind of a risk in order to hire people and get them on the job. That's, you know, again, non-regulated testing, strictly within their ability to do so. But, you know, we really like the idea of people combining it with a lab-based test to get that additional assurance of, you know, the laboratory accuracy.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and conclude where we won't be able to get to the rest of the questions today, but we'll answer all the questions and we'll make sure that anybody who asks a question gets an answer. Let me just say in conclusion that personally, and Brian knows this, any drug testing method that works, I'm in favor of. And I'm excited about the recent developments with oral fluid testing. I'm excited about some of these new testing methodologies. It takes, you know, decades sometimes for some of these things to really gain approval and get FDA clearance and things of that nature. So 20 years from now, who knows how we'll be doing drug testing. But I can say 20 years ago that oral fluid testing never really sort of got mentioned in our annual survey of the drug testing industry, which Current Consulting Group has been doing for 23 years now. And now it's a prominent part of every survey that we do, whether it's employers or drug testing providers, because it's such a hot topic. And in the future, it may be other testing methods as well. But when drug testing works, it's a great way to identify people who need help, and it's proven to be a very effective way to deter drug abuse in the workplace. And so with that, let me turn the microphone back over to Jessica, who will tell you how you can get a hold of the recording for today's presentation.
Thank you so much to Bill and to Brian for that information. And thank you for your attendance today in this webinar presentation. We would like to also inform you that today's presentation has qualified for professional development credits from SHRM and CCDAP for those who attended the entire live presentation. If you're interested in those credits, we're going to send you out the information so that you can have that information with you. We also, as we mentioned earlier, have recorded today's presentation, and so we'll send you a link to that recording so you can review it again and share it with your colleagues if you like. Thank you so much for joining us today, and this concludes today's webinar.